Alright guys, here we are, watercolor. So, there is going to be a kit that has all the things that you need, and at the beginning of class you'll grab your kit and then you'll probably grab some water so you can go ahead and get started. So before I show you guys the skill builder that we're going to be working on, I want to kind of talk through the kit and what some of the things are. There's a lot of different components that are going to be used throughout the unit that we are going to be working on around watercolor, and so immediately some of these things are not going to be used right away, but they eventually will be. So in the kit, of course, you have the watercolor pan set. You have a little bag of salt, which again we will use here in the next assignment, but we can just kind of ignore this for now. We have a little wax block, which again we are going to be using in the next assignment, so you can ignore that as well. Then we also have a little thing of drawing gum, which again I will get more in depth of what this is and how to use it. But again, for the first skill builder that we're going to be working on, we're only going to need the watercolors, brushes, and our water cups. With that said, there's also some paint brushes in the kit. There's also a little water dropper, right? Just in case you need extra water in your palette and you're having a hard time grabbing it with your paintbrush. Of course, you have a palette, and then of course you have 2 water cups. Now, the water cups, the reason why there's 2 is because when you're using watercolors, it is very easy to kind of get your cup dirty because of course you're washing off your brush, and before you know it the water is going to turn brown, and a dark brown, and that might start affecting the things that you're painting. That color is going to transfer over to your paper, and that's something that we may not want. So you're going to have essentially, I'm going to call it a dirty cup, where you first initially wash your brush, and then of course if you're transitioning colors or you're going to like a yellow or lighter color, then of course you can wash your brush a second time in the more clean water to have a nice fresh brush for the next color that you might be transitioning to. So with this said, every day that you come into class you'll grab your bin, and then of course you'll take your cups, you'll fill them up with water. I suggest filling them up about halfway so that of course you don't have to deal with any spilling, and you can kind of control it a little bit better, and then of course you guys will get right to work. Alright guys, so I went ahead and grabbed myself some water. Remember again, fill the jars about halfway so that you can have a little bit better control when using and washing out your brushes. And on my desk I just have my watercolor pans, I have my paint brushes, I'm leaving out the water dropper just in case, and then I have my palette, and then of course I grabbed a paper towel. It's very important before you start your day that you grab a paper towel so that you can clean your brushes, again if you need to transition colors, so that you're not mixing them together and getting kind of a weird funky mix of colors. Now, for the rest of the things, of course, I left it inside my bin, and I'm going to, of course, advise you guys just to set your bin on the side so that it doesn't get in the way, but you still, of course, have access to whatever might be in there that you need for what you're creating in that moment. So, when we're using watercolors, of course, you're going to have your watercolor pan, right? When you're using these colors and when you are mixing some together, so like let's say you want green but you want a lighter green, so of course you're going to mix green and yellow together, you want to do the mixing on the palette. So I'm going to take a paintbrush, I'm going to start dipping it in water, and again this is going to apply to anything that you're going to be doing and mixing. If you need to mix colors, you don't want to do it in the pan, because then of course all the colors start getting mixed together and it gets kind of awkward and weird. So to make sure that everything is nice and tidy, you're going to want to make sure again that you mix your colors on the palette. So here I'm grabbing a bunch of green. Okay. When I am done grabbing the amount of color that I need, I'm going to make sure that I wash my brush off. Usually what I do is I dip the brush down and I kind of just scrape it at the bottom to make sure that I agitate the bristles. Once that's clean, we're good to go. Now, this water was clean to begin with, so I don't necessarily need to do a second dip in the very clean water because of course my brush is relatively clean and ready to go to the next color. So here is my green. Now I'm going to go ahead and mix just a little bit of yellow. Now when I do that again, I want to make sure that my brush is relatively clean so that I don't get the colors kind of mixed together. So as I'm doing this, notice how I'm just scraping on the side of the palette. I'm not dipping into the green, because if I did so, then I'd get green all over my brush, and then that kind of would defeat the purpose of using this palette. As you can imagine, when you're using watercolors, it is very easy to kind of get sloppy very fast, so you want to just make sure that you are, again, being as clean as possible and kind of managing and mixing your colors. So once I get enough, I can go ahead and mix together, and then I have the color that I mixed together that I want to use for my work. Now, again, when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're cleaning off your brush in between each color before you dip into the next color, so that, again, you don't have to worry about getting them all mixed up here on the palette. So, with that said, we're going to go ahead and start our skill builder. Our skill builder is going to consist of 2 pages. As you can imagine, when you're using watercolors, it's important to note and kind of have a couple skills under our belt. The first one is going to be mixing colors, right? Yes, you have a palette, and there are 8 colors available, but as you can imagine, when we think about the color wheel, there are significantly more colors than that. And since you have access to all the primaries and some of the secondaries, you have full control of being able to create whatever color that you're looking for. So again, you're going to be mixing the colors on this palette here, and kind of going back and forth to recreate some different unique mixes of colors. Now here, what you're going to do is, it's a grid, so if it's intersecting, that means you're going to mix those 2 colors together. So this square is going to be strictly red. The next one is going to be red mixed with orange. This one's going to be red mixed with yellow, red mixed with green, and so on. So here, you're going to have an opportunity to kind of mix all of the colors together and just kind of see what happens when you do so. So I'm going to go ahead and do this first square right here. I'm not going to do red because red is obvious, but I'm going to do red-orange. So as I'm working on this, remember, again, we want to use our palette right here. So here, as we established, we want to make sure that we clean our brush. Now that this water is dirty, I want to kind of make sure that my brush is clean from there, and then I can do my last initial clean in the clean water to make sure that there is no green or yellow left on the brush. So again, I am mixing orange and red. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to try to get, to the best of my ability, equal parts of orange and equal parts of red. So as I'm doing that, remember again, kind of just dipping into the orange, and I'm just sliding on that edge to get as much paint into the well as I can. Now remember, you don't need too much, because of course you're only painting a little square, and actually you're going to have to paint 2 squares. So as you're mixing, you kind of want to just think about how much paint you're going to need for 2 of these small squares. Now I'm transitioning colors, so I wash my brush initially in the dirty water. Once that's done, I'll wash it in the clean water, and then I'm ready to move forward. If you want to dry your brush because it just has a little bit more control like that, it's up to you, but it's not necessarily required. So now I'm grabbing the red, kind of dipping in, getting some water to activate the red. Again, remember, I'm trying to get equal parts just as much as I put orange, and so of course you're going to be the one who is gauging and deciding how much that's going to be. Once you get enough, you can mix it together, and then you have your red-orange color ready to go. When you're painting, this is where it's going to get a little tricky. Now, with watercolors, remember that you can add more water, and that will make sure that your color is slightly transparent, or you can add more paint with less water to make sure that your color is a little bit more pigmented. So depending on what you're going for, I want you guys to intentionally practice those different types of use when you're using watercolor. So here I got my first square done. There's a second square over here that's also red-orange, so I'm just going to go ahead and finish that up. So your goal here is to make sure that not only that you mix the colors correctly, but you also try your best to kind of be as neat and clean as you possibly can. You will start to learn quickly that when you have a lot of water, the watercolors kind of just want to go anywhere and everywhere that it chooses. So again, you have full control, so you don't have to have as much water on your brush in order to start. You can totally dry it off, and then again just kind of control and manipulate what you have going on the page. So eventually your mixing, once you get done, is going to look something like this. So next up on the skill builder sheet, you are going to do exercise number 2, which is a range of hue. So this is going to essentially force you to play with different colors and transitioning to a different color, but having different steps in between. When you're creating, as you can imagine, you might be in a situation where you need to create a value where it goes from dark to light, and it might be dark blue to light green, and of course with watercolors we have to be able to control that. So here again, you're going to start with blue, and then gradually you'll start adding a little bit of green at a time. So here, to give you just a little bit of an example, again I'm going to clean my brush in the dirty water. Move this over so we can see. And remember, since we're transitioning to a different color, I'm going to clean my brush one more time in the clean water to make sure that I have a nice clean brush. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with my first square here. So I'll grab some blue, and then I'll just simply paint that one square blue. Now, I'm not using my palette right away because, of course, I'm only using the color blue. Therefore, I don't need to do any mixing. So once you get blue into the first square, you are then going to go ahead, and that's where you're going to start using your palette to mix. Because again, the goal here is to start to transition from blue to green. So what you're going to do is you are going to take your palette. We're going to use this little well right here. I'm going to grab as much blue as I can. And for this one, we have 4 different squares that we're going to need to paint, so we're going to want to start with a lot of blue. So again, take your paintbrush, grab as much blue as you can, get it in that well. Again, take your brush, kind of rub it up against the corner so that all the paint kind of just drips down into the well. And then once that's done, remember the goal is to transition to green, so the first square is going to have a little bit of green. So as you continue onto each square, you're going to gradually add more and more green until eventually you get to green. So since I have blue here and now there's blue on my paintbrush, again I'm going to want to wash my brush in the dirty water. And then since I'm transitioning colors, I'll wash it one more time in the clean water just to make sure I got any and all color off the brush. And then I'll grab just a little bit of green. And again, since I just need a little bit, I'm not going to bother trying to wipe it on the corner because I'm going to use all of it. And that's all that I need. So once I mix, then of course I'll go ahead and I'll start painting that next square. And so as you can see, it is a kind of more of like a really dark bluish green. And as you go, you're going to eventually again get to green. So your final product should look something like this, where it starts at blue and then it gradually progresses into green. Alright, next exercise. Exercise number 3. So this exercise is going to be blending color. So there are many different ways that you can blend colors together, but one of the most popular is to take one color, which in this case we're going to use red, and another color, which we're going to use orange. And the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to make sure that your brush is as clean as possible. So remember, you're going to go ahead and then clean your brush in the dirty cup, and then just kind of clean it off on the corner to make sure you got all the water, and then you're just going to double clean it in the clean cup just to make sure that there is no color. And then for this exercise, you're going to go ahead and you're going to paint the whole square with just white water. Or excuse me, just water with no color. White water, my goodness, where did I get that from? So here, since this water is clean, I can kind of use it still. and you're just going to paint just the square. Now, watercolor is going to want to kind of bend, mold, and kind of move how it wants. And so when there's water present on the page, again, the watercolor is going to want to just go wherever the water is. And so if there's water all over the page, it'll naturally kind of blend and come together in the center. So the first color that we're going to do is red. And so since my brush is clean, I'm going to go ahead and dip into some red. Now I don't need to use my palette because, again, I'm not mixing colors. And I'm going to take my red and I'm just going to go here in the corner and I'm just going to place the red right over here. So notice how the red is starting to slowly bleed into the center. And I really want this red, so I want to just make sure that I put as much red on the very end as I possibly can. Another thing to note is that the paint is not going anywhere but where the water was. So again, when you're trying to blend colors together, this is a great way to control and make sure that it's only going where you want it to. Now we're transitioning to orange, so of course I need to clean my brush and free it from any of the red, which again I'm going to dip it in the dirty water, kind of clean it off a little bit, and then dip it into the clean water just to make sure there's nothing there. Then I'll dip into orange, my pan over here, and then I'll do the same thing on the other side. So here with the orange, again, you'll start to notice that the water is kind of going where the water is. Now this one isn't going to want to move over as much as the red one, so you're just going to have to kind of encourage it to do so. So I'm just kind of flicking it over, and then once it gets to the center, you can kind of take your brush and kind of just swirl it together. And then you'll start to notice, again, that you give this nice transitional blend from red to orange. Your dry product should look something like this. Okay, our next exercise, watercolor number 5. So understanding value. So just like what we worked off with our pencils and just value throughout the entire semester, the darker qualities can be transitioned into lighter qualities, and that's going to create a more three-dimensional feel on your two-dimensional surface. Now with your pencil, you would have to push harder or use a different pencil to get a darker value, but of course with watercolor, you can't press harder. The only thing that you could do is add or take away paints. So by now, I'm sure you have learned and kind of experienced that the more water that you add, the more transparent the color is, and the more paint that you add, the more darker or more value the color has. So here in this exercise, we're going to practice transitioning from red and then just kind of going all the way down to a transparent, almost very, very light red. And so to do this effectively, what you're going to want to start with, and you are going to use one of your wells, you're going to make sure that, again, your brush is clean. So remember, dip it into that dirty water cup. Just make sure that you've gotten all the paints off, and then just dip your last moment in the clean water cup to make sure that your brush has no color on it. And then, of course, you're going to go ahead and start with that first square. Now, for this one, although you're not necessarily mixing color, you're going to go ahead and still load up this well with a bunch of red. And the reason for that is, again, you're trying to transition from a very rich, full color red, and then you're transitioning to a bunch of water to make it just kind of light and transparent. So again, you will see here in just a sec what I mean by that. So the first step, make sure that you get a bunch of watercolor into your well. So we're good. A little messy there. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this paint and I'm going to paint my first square red. So remember, when you're working on this, make sure that you are doing your best to kind of control the colors and not let it get too crazy. So try to stay within the squares. I've gone out a little bit, yes. But I'm trying to do this example as quick as I can. So the next one, what you're going to do is you're going to add just a little bit more water than that's already here. Okay? So you have a few ways of doing this. You can clean your brush off and make sure that there's no paint on your brush and just add a little bit of water with your paintbrush, or you can take your water dropper and you can kind of just grab some of that clean water and then just put a drop or two into the well. Now once you do that, of course you can go ahead and mix the color, and when you paint your next square, you will notice that the paint is not as pigmented as the first square. And so as you're doing this, you're going to gradually add more and more water so that eventually you have a nice scale going from dark to light. So in this first column, you're going to use just red, and you're going to gradually add more and more water to kind of get a very transparent light red. And then in the next column, you're going to go ahead and do the same exact method, but you're going to be using black. So instead of adding more and more water, you're just going to gradually add little bits of black until you get to a just solid black. Then, of course, you're going to go ahead and continue that practice with a different color, just because, again, this skill right here is probably the most important when it comes to using watercolor and painting with watercolor, because in arts and anything that you're trying to create, value is, for the most part, the most important thing to kind of grasp and learn and master. And once you're able to do that, you're able to create very beautiful, very striking images. Alright guys, exercise number 5. So making shadows continued. So there are a few methods to making shadows in your work, and mostly it's going to be mixing the complement together or a little bit of black in the color that you're using to create the shadows. So again, this exercise is also going to help us kind of start creating different values to create a three-dimensional form or shape. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of demo that for you here now. So remember, I just finished using green up over in the understanding value exercise. Now I want to make sure that, again, like I said, wash your brush off in the dirty water first, kind of dab it at the bottom, make sure that it agitates those bristles, and then go ahead and dip it into the clean water to make sure that you have no paint left over from your last exercise. Now, when trying to create this here, remember that when you add significantly more water to the color that you're using, it becomes transparent. Now, since we are working with a sphere here, remember a sphere, when depending on your light source, has to be, it goes from light and then it gradually goes to dark. So kind of think back to that exercise we did with our colored pencils and how we created value, or even with our graphite pencils, and how we went darker on the outer edges and then lighter on the inner. So here we take some of this yellow, and I'm only taking just a little bit, and I'm kind of putting it down with more water. And again, since I'm only using one color, I don't necessarily need to use the palette. Of course, if you feel a little bit more comfortable using the palette, by all means go ahead and do so. But here, my goal is to kind of get just the lightest value in the upper corner as possible. Now, since I'm going to be painting all of it, kind of a darker value, don't hesitate to just paint the whole thing this lightest value, because you can gradually add more and more yellow as you're going. So once you've done this, then of course I'm going to dip back in and grab a little bit more yellow, and I'm going to start packing the darker values of yellow kind of here on the outer edge. Okay, so now remember, since your page is wet, there's already water there. When you add more and more value, it's going to want to kind of go anywhere the water is. So here is where the challenge is of controlling where our values are going. So watercolors, remember, again, are controlled with water. So if you have some areas that are a little bit darker and they shouldn't be, what you could do simply is just clean your brush off, make sure that it's free of any color, so dip it in the dirty water first, and then clean it off in the clean water, and then you can take this clean brush, and honestly I would go ahead and dry it off first, and then with this dry brush you can kind of go back in and then just brush down those darker values that you don't want. Since again the brush is dry, or as dry as it can be, you essentially are now being able to manipulate the colors and kind of move them around as needed. So that's going to help you kind of control the transitions going from dark to light in one specific space. So before I move on, I think I want my kind of bottom area just to be a little bit darker with a little bit more yellow. So I'm just going to make sure that I pack it in there nice and heavy so that it's nice and pigmented. And then I'm going to move on to my violet yellow shadow. So here is where you're going to want to make sure that you use the palette, or excuse me, the palette here to mix colors. So I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow, I'm going to pop it into the well. And then anytime that you're using a dark color with a light color, you're going to need just a little bit, and I repeat, just a little bit of the darker color to make it look like a shadow. So here, I'm going to use violet. I'm going to take just a little bit of the violet, and I'm going to mix it together, and then voila, I have my shadow. So here, I'll paint my shadow in, using that color mix that I did in the palette to achieve my shadow. Voila. So with this, you're going to be doing the same here in the next one, but instead of using purple or violet, you're going to be using just a little bit of black. And again, remember, since black is such a dark color, you can only add just a little bit for it to be effective. You still want it to be yellow, but just kind of tinted down or shaded down just a little bit. Okay? And then of course you're going to try it with orange, and then we're going to move on to exercise number 7. Alright guys, exercise number 7. So very similar to exercise number 6, where we're going to try to create form out of a two-dimensional surface. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use our watercolors and we're going to manipulate them and try to recreate this cone here on the left-hand side. So when doing this, there are a few ways to approach creating, and what we're going to want to do is we're going to kind of want to just start with getting our work area with some water. Now we don't want to put too much water, because if we put too much water, we've learned that the values tend to kind of just go all over the place. And so I'm just kind of wetting my surface and just kind of getting down some water so it's kind of easier to work with. Now once I have my water down, I am then going to go ahead and start grabbing some green. Now remember, since I'm only using one color, I don't necessarily have to use the palette, but if you want to, you are more than welcome to. Now here, our goal is to have the lightest value possible on the outer edge, the outer left side. And so you only need just a little bit of paint. If you grab too much, that's okay. Remember, you can take the paint and kind of manipulate it and kind of push it in other areas where you might need that paint. Now that I have my first layer, if you will, I'm going to go in and I'm going to start grabbing just a little bit more green, and I'm going to start transitioning, going from light to dark. Now here, since the page is a little wet, the page is receiving this color a lot easier if it was completely dry. So when you're painting, just know that when you are trying to get a color down and kind of control it, you got to make sure that your work is just a little bit wet so that it has an easier time receiving these colors. Now there's going to be a point where you need to start transitioning from light to dark, and there might be a hard line. So in order to blend out that hard line, I always like to just take my brush when there's not very much paint and kind of just rub the area, the line where it's kind of going from light to dark. When you rub the line, it kind of just tends to blend in. So going here, the outer edge is going to be significantly darker, because again we're trying to recreate this kind of three-dimensional curve of this cone. And so on the very outer edges, that's where my darkest values are going to go. So once those are there, we're going to now work on transitioning from dark to light. And so I'm just going to go in here, and I'm going to start kind of playing around with the values that I already have and kind of pushing them so that they mix together. So once I get this all mixed up, I have still a hard line here, so I'm going to take this paintbrush that doesn't have very much paint, and I'm just going to kind of blend it in. Now if it's getting too dark too fast, that means that this paint is kind of transitioning over. So a good idea would be to clean your brush and then dry your brush off with that paper towel, and then go in and do the same thing that you were doing to kind of eliminate that hard dark line. So here, just to kind of touch things up, I'm going to continue adding more darker values on the outer edge so that I can achieve that three-dimensional feel and look. So again here, hard line, I'm going to clean my brush, I'm going to dry my brush off with that paper towel, and then I'm just going to take my dry brush, or somewhat dry brush, and I'm just going to kind of manipulate the colors so they kind of blend in nicely. And voila, I have a little bit darker here, so I'll just take my brush that's kind of a little bit more dry. I'm going to clean it, dry it off with that paper towel, and then I'm just going to, voila. And so as you can imagine, you can be going back and forth all day to make this perfect. And it's always a good idea to know when to stop. So, with that said, that's complete. Good job.